Now that you've validated the need, the next step is to come up with a minimum viable product, or MVP. What is a minimum viable product? Well, it is the smallest instantiation of the product that actually meets the need. If the need you've identified is the need for a bicycle, then a unicycle is not a minimum viable product. A bicycle that doesn't have any lights, doesn't have a bell, maybe has only one gear, might be a minimum viable product. If your idea is a marketplace in which you can buy and sell, your minimum viable product needs to include buying and selling. But it may not need to include forums. It may not need to include many different product categories. It may not include a lot of detail that you will add later. So think about what the core of your product is. What is the minimum viable product that people can actually use and that starts to meet the need that you have just validated? How should you go about building the minimum viable product? You should build it as quickly as you can and as cheaply as you can. As much as possible, when you build your minimum viable product, you want to focus on where you are solving the need that you have validated, the unique value that you're adding. And every other component you want to take as much as possible from an existing vendor that is well established or an existing open source project. Let's take the example of Etsy, a marketplace for handmade goods. When Rob, Haim, and Chris were starting to build Etsy, they didn't go back and first write a database system. They just used an existing database. For your MVP, don't look for the perfect components. Don't think everything needs to be 100% scalable. You don't need to be able to service millions of customers because you won't have millions of customers to begin with. Your entire goal with the MVP is to make sure that you're actually building something that really meets the need. So we had the validation as a first cut. The MVP is now we want to really solve the need and we want to show that we can solve the need. It is unlikely that your founding team will include all the skills you need to build the MVP. For instance, you might not have a designer as part of your team. Well, the great news is there are lots of wonderfully talented designers out in the world. And so you can go find a designer online, and that designer can create the initial design for your MVP. And later on, when your company is further along, you can bring somebody on board full time. In creating your MVP, you want to keep things as simple as possible. Whenever you're tempted to add features that aren't absolutely necessary, just put them on a list for things to do later. It's always better to get your MVP out the door quickly. And essentially, a good guiding motive is you should be quite embarrassed by your MVP. You should think, oh my God, I don't really want to show this to people. But that's when you should start showing it to people. Just keep in mind that the thing that's crucial about your MVP is that it can actually be used. There's some great examples of companies that today still look very much like the MVP that they launched with. Two that come to mind are Craigslist and Twitter. Craigslist today is still very much the way Craigslist was when it first launched. The MVP was literally the ability to list an item and for somebody else to go find that item. Twitter, much the same. The MVP of Twitter was I can make a tweet and I can follow other people's tweets. Again, Twitter has added features since then, but the core experience of Twitter is still very much what the MVP experience was like. So when you think about the MVP, think about the core elements of the experience that you want to have. And don't think about, are they super pretty? Is it going to scale? Those are all problems you can address down the line. But the core aspects of the experience, those need to be included in your MVP. One of the things that may be tempting, but you should really avoid, is to build your MVP with a large corporation as your partner. So this could be a consulting firm or a design firm or even an engineering firm. That hardly ever works because the rhythm of large corporations just do not lend themselves to the rapid iteration that's required on an MVP. Etsy built the MVP of the marketplace in 2.5 months. The Etsy team had to learn a bunch of new things as they were doing it, but they picked them up quickly themselves. The reason you need to do things relatively quickly is because if they take a long time, you are spending a lot of money, and you're also not getting the crucial feedback that your MVP produces. When you're looking for external skills that are not on your team, as much as possible, try to work with individual contributors. Use services such as Upwork, or if you're looking for designers, go look on services like Forced or Dribbble or Behance. The reason is you will find people who know how to get things done quickly, who don't have a lot of overhead, and where you can get some sense of the quality of their work through people that they've worked with before or through projects that they've put out there. Same goes for if you need additional engineers. Always prioritize for people who can contribute quickly, who have a proven track record of producing quality output, and who don't have high overhead. Another failure mode in building an MVP is to think too far ahead. You think, what will my service be like when I have millions of listings? How will people find a listing? Let me build a very complex search for listings. Well, when your service launches, it likely won't have millions of listings, so that's not really an issue. Don't try to anticipate too many problems down the line that might arise in usage. Focus on the things that people absolutely need today. And be willing to do things that are certainly not going to scale. There's a great story about Airbnb, which today is a massive business. But Airbnb in the early days was kind of hobbling along, and people weren't really using the service very much. And one key insight that the founders had suddenly was that the reason was that people weren't trusting the listings, and part of why they were not trusting the listings was because the photography that people submitted was really poor. And so instead of saying, how can we somehow in an automated fashion improve people's images using computer vision or artificial intelligence, they just said, hey, why don't we send some photographers to people and create higher quality images? That's definitely not going to scale, but it's going to test whether or not that really is the thing that's holding people back. And also, once we've done that, other people can see the quality of images that should exist, and that'll help raise the bar for everybody. And sure enough, that worked. So whenever you encounter something in building your MVP where your reaction is, oh, I need a very complex solution that will work 5 years from now when I have millions of users or hundreds of customers, rein yourself in and think, what do I need to launch my MVP? And sometimes, many times, the answer is not more code. It's not a more complex piece of hardware. It's actually using humans to solve the problem. The much more common issue is that this isn't actually a problem. And so if you spend lots of time and money coming up with a technological solution, you may only find yourself disappointed in having invested all that time and money for something that people aren't actually encountering as a real problem on your service, or that you haven't actually solved people's real need, and so as a result, your service isn't in fact, or your product isn't in fact growing. That is the high order bit problem. The high order bit problem is, have you solved the need, not will it work for hundreds, thousands, or millions of customers. Once you have something that people love, then you can go back and fix all those problems. So what if you put your minimum viable product out there and people aren't using it? One of the biggest temptations is to add more features to your product. People are not using it because it doesn't do enough. So you think you need to add things. Coming back to the example of the bicycle, the temptation is, oh, well, people do need a bell, and people do need lights, and people do need better handlebars and a better seat. And you can become obsessed with adding lots of features to your product. But in all likelihood, people are not using it because the core mechanic of the product, the core thing that it does, isn't actually solving that problem. And adding more features tends to obscure that more than it tends to solve that. So when you are at the MVP stage and people are not actually using your MVP, and they're not coming back and they're not giving you positive feedback on your MVP, don't go to adding features, go to understanding what exactly it is that's really holding them back from using your product or service. Even components that might eventually be core to your product could initially be outsourced to a third party. For instance, when Etsy first launched, all payment on Etsy was handled via PayPal. It was only later that Etsy added their own payment system. It didn't matter whether that payment was deeply and elegantly integrated into the core experience. It got the job done. That's what you're looking for in MVP. Get the job done. The MVP is really the ultimate validation step. It's when you know that you have actually solved somebody's need. And so the faster you can get to that, the better, because once you've launched your MVP, you will see whether you're actually solving people's needs or whether, despite the validation step, you've actually missed the mark.